This video is going to be about something I wanted to talk about for quite a while, and that is aerial combat in Tribes Ascent. Because basically there are two ways to fight during aerial combat. Either you chain or you go for midairs. And these are fundamentally different. They work differently, they play differently, they are differently balanced, and there are a lot of differences. And I want to talk about two specific things. The first one is game feel, the second one is going to be balance. So, part 1, game feel. What do I mean by that? Well, ask yourself the following question. Why is it that almost every new player starts out preferring midairs over chain? Why is it that many people think that chain does not require skill? Because that is weird if you think about it. Usually in a game, anything that would require skill is also perceived as requiring skill. And the answer to that is actually quite simple. It's all about sensitivity. And by sensitivity I mean literally your in-game sensitivity. Basically, any new player starts out with a very high sensitivity. And what that means is that not only do they not hit as much as they could, they don't play as well as they could, but they also play in a way that is so categorically different that the feel they get from using automatic weapons is different than from what a competitive player will get. So in the background you will be seeing some video clips demonstrating exactly that. And right now you can see how when I am using a very high sensitivity, I'm not able to track movement, I'm not able to track a target, and I'm not able to land even close to, well, not even half of my shots, far less in fact. Basically, because new players start out with a high sensitivity and many of them either don't change, or even if they do, they still don't change it enough, they are never able to, well, chain properly. They're never able to fully track a target and to one-clip someone. And the consequence is that to them chain doesn't just feel not as effective as it could be, but it also feels like a bad weapon to use, and not bad in the sense of it's weak, but bad in the sense that its game feel isn't good. So what's game feel? Basically, with any game you have an input-output feedback loop. So the game gives you output on, well, your screen and your headset, and you give input with your mouse and your keyboard. And basically the better that input-output feedback loop works, the better the game feel. That's kind of abstract, I'll admit. But think about it this way. Imagine a game where, for example, an output does not require you to immediately do anything, like a turn-based game. In those games you will never feel truly invested in the character or whatever it is you are playing. And in fact games like these, such as say Civilization or XCOM, well, they work differently than a first-person shooter. In a first-person shooter the input-output loop is always quite closely linked, and therefore you will always feel very much like being the person you are playing. And chain, well, with chain, the thing is, you shoot, you spray your shots at someone with your high sensitivity, you don't hit a lot. And then, well, you get some hits and you think, well, this was pointless. And you feel like chaining is a matter of spraying, and it's not really skillful. You feel like it's completely random how much you hit. And now compare that to a midair. A midair, well, you fire one shot with your spin fusor, and either you hit or you don't. And if you hit, you actually get not only rewarded because, well, you hit a shot, but you get amazing visual feedback. You get a blue plate special, you get a special ka-ching sound indicating that yes, something did actually happen. And these are the kind of things which maybe not consciously but subconsciously influence how people perceive the game they are playing. So what does that mean? Well, it means that as people play and they get kills with chain, they get kills with midairs, they feel, well, one of these is very rewarding, the other one really is not. And that is why almost every player, even almost every competitive player who started playing this game, when they started, felt like midairs were amazing and chain wasn't. And that's not necessarily a problem. Now, that might sound weird, but consider this. Once you lower your sensitivity, once you get better at the game, the way you play with chain fundamentally changes. And it gets altered in that now you're suddenly not just spraying at your enemy. Instead, now it becomes about specifically tracking the exact movement of a player, the exact trajectory a player is taking. And that's a different thing, because then suddenly you do have direct input-output feedback. So based on where your bullets go, you immediately try to correct, you immediately try to adjust. And for your input, for how good you aim, you get rewarded, because on the screen you can see the damage numbers or the hit markers tick up, and you can, well, see your enemies drop dead. So basically, as your skill increases, and as you have a better sensitivity, the way it feels, the game feel of these weapons changes as well. And that's very interesting, because in many games that's not the case, and that's why a player who, well, the kind of people who you might find on Reddit complaining that chain is bad and shouldn't be a powerful thing in the game, well, they play either with a bad sensitivity or they are just not good at the game in general, and they can't imagine that these fundamentals, these core aspects of game feel, could ever change with skill. And that's basically why you see people complaining, why you see people saying, oh, chain is bad, chain shouldn't be in the game. So the takeaway here is chain might feel unsatisfying, it might feel unfun, and it might feel like it isn't skillful and it is just about spraying and spamming. But if you get a better sensitivity and if you get better at the game, these fundamentals, they change. So that is something that just needs to be understood, because if it isn't understood, well, then you will always have a very weird perspective onto how the game works. Because then that taints any kind of balance discussion you go into, because then, well, you want to discuss balance? Yeah, well, you're already thinking that one of the gun is just a spray and pray no skill weapon. So obviously, well, that perspective is not the most constructive. So let's talk about balance. So if we say, okay, chain in principle is actually also a rewarding thing, can be a rewarding system, and can feel fun, can feel satisfying, and arguably getting a one clip with chain can feel more satisfying than getting a midair with your spin fuser. Okay, that's nice, I guess. So we're now at the point where we can say chain and midairs are in a way identical. They are guns and you shoot and you have fun and you have good game feel and so on. So let's talk about balance. Now balance is a bit of a weird one, because it depends. The balance depends on what you want. What do you want to achieve? Now you might say, well, you want to achieve that all guns are equally good, but do you really? For example, chaining someone who's on the ground AD-ADing is not very effective, and ground pounding someone is very effective and very easy. So by that logic, you might say, oh, well, this isn't balanced, they're not equally strong, but they shouldn't be. The weapons can have different purposes, different powers. However, there is one point that I would like to specifically explain in more greater detail, and that is how skill and luck play into this discussion. So how does skill work in this game? Well, on a basic level it's like this. You have guns which fire shots and you either hit or you don't. Now, whether or not you hit technically depends on, well, where you are aiming and where you are and where your opponent is and where the both of you are moving. But that's not really useful. That's not really a good way to describe what is happening. That is technically true, but practically worthless. And what I mean by that is, like, consider this. If I gave you, say, a video of two people fighting, then I stopped the clip and said, okay, now who's gonna win? Then you would say, well, I don't know. Or maybe you'll say that maybe if one person is really low, you don't. But if two people are at full health, they just flew up, none of them have fired yet, and I ask you, well, who's going to hit his shot? Obviously, there is no way of knowing that. But what you will find is, of course, if you analyze such a situation, a standardized situation, the kind of situation you are going to be seeing in the background right now, two people standing at the same kind of place and they fly up and shoot at each other over and over and over again, well, what's going to happen? I mean, obviously there's going to be some difference. It's not going to be that one person wins every time. And it's also not going to be that one person hits every shot or doesn't hit any shots. Instead, what's going to happen is, of course, that a certain amount will be hit, a certain ratio of shots will be hit. And that is going to be the model which I will be using to describe how hitting in this game very basically works. Simply put, a player has a certain hit probability. Now that probability depends on the gun he is using and the situation he is in, but then it also depends on two main points. The first one is aiming, basically his aim skill. So a player with better aim will be able to hit more. Duh. The second one is positioning. Now, I did mention that it depends on the situation overall, but within a given situation, of course, a player who has better positioning skill, who is more intelligent about how he moves, will be able to even further increase his hit probability or decrease that of his opponent. Think of strafing, for example. A player doesn't strafe, and any enemy will have an easier time chaining that player. A player does strafe, and, well, suddenly the hit probability drops for all the opponents. So these are the two core points. And of course there's going to be fluctuation there. That skill is not going to be a constant value. People are in different form and different shape at different times of the day and at different days and so on. And of course as they improve at the game, as they play the game longer, their skill, both positioning wise and aiming wise, will increase. But if we just say, okay, we look at one duel, for example, and we look at two people fighting at each other, then how does their skill relate to how many kills they get? Well, this is a question that math can answer, luckily at least. So basically here's what I did. I assumed, okay, a player has a certain hit probability and each shot will either be hit or not hit with that probability. Now, where exactly the specific number comes from is irrelevant here. Obviously, actually attaining that number would be very difficult, because you would need a big sample size and it's going to fluctuate quite a bit, but this is just to give a general overview of how things work. So what I did, and I will be linking the code in the description of this video, I wrote a MATLAB script which basically just simulates a bunch of fights. Specifically, I have two people and I'm running a loop which basically just lets them shoot one bullet, or it just simulates one event, and the base probability of that is the probability of the players that I gave as parameters. And then if it hits, it's it counts up by one, if it doesn't, it doesn't, and then it keeps doing that until the set number of hits is reached. And then that process is repeated 100,000 times, which basically means 100,000 fights are being simulated. And each time it's checked, well, who won, who lost, or, well, yeah, who got the kill. And based on that, a ratio is computed. Now, as you might imagine, what's the defining factor now? What's the real difference? Because chain and midairs are practically identical. The only difference is the amount of hits you need to kill someone. And those who are familiar with the way statistics work might already realize why this is important. Basically, there's something called the law of great numbers, which says that any kind of random process will probably, any random process has a certain base probability. However, the more often you perform that random process, the more often it happens, the more the results will converge towards the actual base probability. So you throw a dice and you will get, well, any kind of number. Obviously, you throw a dice twice, you will get, well, 2 results. But if you throw a dice 1,000,000 times, then you will probably have, well, 1/6 of a million ones and 1/6 of a million twos and so on. There will be some variation, but that variation is not going to be as big as it is if you just throw it, say, 6 times. And the mathematical way of phrasing that is that the variance of the values you get scales with the square root of the number of events. So simply put, if you have 100 shots, for example, or 100 dice throws or 100 coin tosses, square root of that is 10. So that's 1/10 of the total number of events. Whereas if you have, say, 1,000,000, then, well, the square root is only 1,000. So instead of 1/10, you have 1,000th of the total amount. So basically, the higher the number of events, the higher the number of random processes that are occurring, the more likely it is that the base probability will become visible in the result. So how does any of that relate to tribes? Well, consider this. if you want to midair someone, well, you need 2 hits, usually. I'm considering a symmetrical fight, like medium versus medium. So with their spin fusor, that's 2 hits. If they chain with, say, an assault rifle, that's 20 hits. That's an order of magnitude more. That, of course, means that the variance, when chaining, is going to be a lot lower, relatively speaking. So, in practical terms, well, after you hit 20 shots, the guy's dead. So, the question is the following. How much more likely is it that the better player will win the fight? Now, for this, I have created the following graph. And what you are seeing here on the x-axis is the hit probability of player A, whatever, which basically goes from 0 to 0.9. I stopped plotting there because it extremely diverged. And the other player has a constant hit probability of 0.7. Now the y-axis is the ratio of kills achieved after these 100,000 runs. Now, for just scientific purposes, if I have 100,000 events, then that means the random variance of that is going to be less than 1%. So these numbers are very solid, basically. Okay, so what are you seeing here? Well, in red you have chain, so 20 hits are needed to achieve a kill. In blue there are midairs, you only need 2 hits, and in green I have said, well, what if you really only need 1 hit? Now the justification behind that is that if you hit 1 midair, well, yes, the enemy isn't dead, but he might as well be. Or, well, to put it another way, consider how often you actually, in a very equally skilled situation, you got midaired and still were able to win. Now, in a public game that might happen if you're playing against someone who is, well, bad, but amongst competitive players, in a pug, in a comp match, in a scrim, whatever, basically if you get midaired, it's all over, usually. So what do these graphs show? Well, what are we looking for? The question is, does the better player win? So if the player A has a probability that's higher than 0.7, he has more, well, skill than the other player. Again, this isn't just purely aiming skill, this is also positioning. It could be that his aim is actually worse than that of player B, but he has better positioning, far better positioning, and therefore has achieved a higher hit probability. Now the question is, does he get rewarded? And it depends on the gun. Basically, the higher the line on the right side of the 0.7 mark, or the lower it is on the left side, the more the skill actually correlates with the result. So let me explain that. You have a certain ratio of kills. If it was only skill dependent, the better player would always win, and then you would basically have a ratio of 0 all the way up to a skill of 0.7, and then a ratio of infinite beyond that. Or maybe not quite, but generally it is going to be that. Now obviously in a game that is not really attainable. There's always going to be random fluctuation and stuff. But what this graph does show is just how much skill matters. Because the line for midairs, and even more so the one for the single hit, is ridiculously flat. You compare the point at 0.6 and the point at 0.8 skill, which is arguably a pretty big difference, and it's almost the fucking same. Basically it means if you're better than another person when it comes to midairs, it doesn't matter. The outcome of the fight is incredibly random. So a value where, for example, with midairs you will have a hit ratio of 1.5 or something. With chain, that is going to be more like 4 or 5 or something. So basically, how do I put this? Basically, the randomness is more relevant when midairing. The outcome of the fight is not as much determined by skill, and it is more common that the worse player will win the fight when midairing. Which of course confirms the conventional wisdom just of playing the game that things like positioning don't really matter when midairing, because, well, it doesn't matter if you get a slightly better position, it doesn't matter if you slightly drop your opponent's probability, because the ratio almost doesn't change. Whereas with chain, again, look at the red line, look how steep it is. The steeper that line, the more skill matters. That is the big point. That is something that I have tried to explain to people, and some have understood it, some have not, some have refused to listen. But these are the facts behind it. These are, well, this is the data, and this is true. This is not something you can explain away. This is definitely not something where you can get out your feelings and talk about how you feel things are and how you feel the game should be. This is the fact. The reality is that only when chaining do you get rewarded for skill as much as, well, when chaining you get rewarded for skill far more than with the other options. And if we especially consider the single hit, the single midair chance, well, that is incredibly flat compared to the other curve. And having any kind of advantage is almost irrelevant. So if we, because let's actually think about competitive gameplay. One of the key points is, of course, that people are going to be at mostly equal skill. Maybe there's a variance of 5%, maybe of 10%. I don't know. I have no idea what the actual hit probabilities of players are. You're welcome to try it out if you want to. However, the big takeaway is people are going to be rather close in skill. And if they are rather close, well, then this chart directly shows you that if a single hit is actually all it takes to decide a duel, then the difference in kills is going to be a lot lower. Basically, being the better player in such a situation is almost completely irrelevant. And that is where we come to, well, Tribes in its current state. So, how was Tribes before the Out of the Blue patch? Because it was quite different, and the core point is the following. Before the Out of the Blue patch, people almost never mid-aired. Sometimes they did, sometimes in asymmetric fights they would mid-air a Hoff, or a Hoff would mid-air an offense player, but often, usually, they just wouldn't. Nowadays, having 3 weapons, having a bigger hitbox on explosive weapons, and having a smaller hitbox on chain, these are the 3 core points which have made midairs far more common. Basically, if you play a pug now, you will be mid-airing all the time. You will be trying to hit those fancy shots whenever you can. And the consequences, well, again, if you hit a single shot, probably you have won. And at that point, we're at the green line, where skill almost matters, well, almost doesn't matter at all, and where luck, where randomness is dominant. That is what I mean when I am on Reddit and talking about how midairs are random, how midairs are bad for competitive gameplay. And, well, I do hope that this kind of helps to explain these things I've been talking about. So, what's the consequence? Well, it's about balance. Basically, if this game is to be balanced for competitive gameplay, if this game is to be designed in such a way that skill matters and is good, then it is necessary that midairs are not viable in aerial combat. Now, there are different ways to go about that. You can make midairs not as viable, for example, by reducing the projectile size on the spin fusers back to their original values, for example. Alternatively, you can make it easier to hit chain by increasing the projectile size on chain, for example. Or you can, of course, tweak things like damage numbers, so make spin fusers just deal not as much damage, making it less viable to actually go for that midair. Or alternatively, changes to, well, the weapon system overall. For example, if people only have 2 weapons, then the midair weapon, the spin fuser, also is the ground pound weapon. If they have 3 weapons, they can afford spamming with one of these weapons, and they can still have a grenade launcher or an arcs buster to actually threaten a player on the ground. Which, again, is something that encourages midairs, and the more midairs are encouraged, the more they are common in area combat, the more that curve goes down and the less skill matters.